Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the last session of our Dunhuang and the Silk Road seminar this term, the Lent term here in Cambridge. And today we have our presenter. We're privileged to have Dr. Mark Dickens, who is a cultural historian working on Syriac Christianity and Central Asia. And he has completed his MPhil and PhD at the University of Cambridge here at Clare Hall in the very same faculty. And he is now affiliated with the University of Groningen. He's a visiting researcher at the Center for East Asian Studies. And today he's going to talk about his research related to the Uyghur Kingdom of Kocho near Turfan. So please welcome Dr. Mark Dickens.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Galambos, for that introduction and for the opportunity to give a talk in this seminar series. And again, greetings to all those that I know who are amongst the attendees. And sorry, it's not like a good old conference where we can just sit down and talk over a cup of coffee, but we'll do our best anyway. So, sorry, I'm trying to change the screen here and, whoops, that's what I want. So reconstructing the history of Christianity in Central Asia, by which I mean the vast region covering what is now Afghanistan, the 5 former Soviet Central Asian republics, and the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in China, as well as Mongolia for that matter, is a challenge for several reasons. Perhaps the most significant of these is that there are no Christians living in the region today with direct links to Christians who lived there before the modern era. Put another way, unlike the Middle East, there is no living community in Central Asia to preserve traditions and indeed aspects of material culture like manuscripts. No group with a sense of responsibility for carrying on beliefs and practices that were present there in late antiquity and the Middle Ages as a result of the Syriac Christians who lived throughout the region. Without a living community in the region to maintain the traditions of these Syriac Christians, it is exceedingly difficult to get a sense of what life would have been like for them. Thus, scholars like me who study Christianity in Central Asia are entirely reliant on what we can find in the all too sparse historical and archaeological sources. We're quite literally dependent on remnants left behind by people who likely never imagined that anyone in the future would attempt to reconstruct their lives from those remains. Unfortunately, those sources are, as my title notes, exceedingly fragmentary, and it seems that we're reliant on serendipitous events to unearth them or otherwise bring them to our attention. One of the most important bodies of data we have in reconstructing the long forgotten life of Christians in Central Asia is the trove of fragmentary texts uncovered by the 2nd and 3rd Prussian Turfan expeditions that conducted archaeological digs in several locations in the Turfan oasis between 1904 and 1907. Erica Hunter has already given important information on these expeditions in a previous talk in this series on Christian amulets from Turfan, so I will not delve into that history any further right now. Rather, my plan in the coming hour is to give an overview of the textual remains that were left behind by the now lost community of Christians in Turfan, followed by a look at selected texts that were uncovered over a century ago by the Prussian expeditions. Before embarking, I should note that all images of Turfan texts are copyright the Berlin Brandenburg Academy of Sciences in the Berlin State Library. Sorry, I'm hitting the, trying to get this to move, and that's what I want. A quick reminder of the importance of Turfan in the broader context of the Silk Road may be helpful, although this will undoubtedly be familiar to many listening today, particularly if you heard Erica Hunter's earlier talk. So Turfan designates a large oasis located some 400 kilometers northeast of the Tarim Basin in modern Xinjiang, China. You can see it there on the map, located somewhat north of Dunhuang. Although we often speak of Turfan as a city, which it is today, historically speaking, it is more accurate to refer to the primary urban center in the oasis by its Chinese name Gaochang or its Turkic name Kocho. Kocho was the capital of an Uyghur kingdom, often referred to as the Uyghur Kingdom of Kocho or the West Uyghur Kingdom, established in the mid-9th century by Turkic Uyghurs who fled south from what is now Mongolia after the Uyghur Kingdom fell in 840. The Uyghurs who fled to Turfan brought with them Manichaeism, which had been the state religion of their empire. But over the subsequent centuries, the majority converted to Buddhism, the predominant religion of the oasis before the Uyghurs arrived. Based on the many languages and scripts that we find amongst extant manuscripts from Turfan, the kingdom must have been characterized by a fairly high degree of cultural, linguistic, and indeed religious diversity. It is clear from the text found at Turfan that in addition to Manichaeism and Buddhism, there were residents of the area who also followed the Christian faith. Although based on the relative number of manuscript fragments, it seems that in relation to the other two predominant religions, Christianity was a minority faith in the oasis. Sorry, I'm having trouble. There we go. There we go. Before going on, a word is in order about the three most important languages used by the Christian community in Turfan, as far as we can tell from the manuscript fragments. The first of these is Syriac, a dialect of Aramaic and hence a Semitic language, attested as early as the 1st century of our era and still used in liturgical context by several churches in the Middle East. Syriac was undoubtedly the primary liturgical language of the Turfan Christians, as well as being the language from which many translations into Sogdian and Uyghur were made. This is especially evident when we consider much of the Sogdian literature used by the monastic community of Bulayak to be discussed below. Having said that, Syriac was likely not used in Central Asia outside of ecclesiastical contexts. And we have no idea how many, if any, Christians would have been effectively native speakers of the language, or indeed how much contact there was with the ecclesiastical hierarchy located far to the west. In short, although reading and chanting Syriac was obviously important for not only Christian clerics, but also the everyday faithful who participated regularly in the liturgy, it was hardly an everyday language of communication in Turfan. The second language of importance to the Christians in Turfan was Sogdian, an Eastern Middle Iranian language spoken initially in Sogdiana, primarily located in what is now Uzbekistan, which went on to become the lingua franca of much of the Silk Road thanks to the Sogdian interest in trade. Given the number of Christian manuscript fragments in Sogdian found at Turfan in both Sogdian script and a modified Syriac script, there is little doubt that it was an important language for the Christians there, suggesting that at some earlier time in the life of the community, there were a significant number of Sogdian Christians resident in the area. Although we do not know how or when Christianity arrived in the Turfan oasis, perhaps, as I've speculated elsewhere, it was the result of Christians fleeing from persecution in China, resulting from an imperial edict in 845, initially aimed at Buddhists, which closed down the institutions of all foreign religions in the Chinese Empire. If so, then foreign Christians living in China, most of whom would have been Sogdians, may have been attracted to the new Uyghur kingdom, located as it was between the xenophobic campaigns of religious persecution in Tang China and the steady advance of Islam into Central Asia from the west. The third language used by the Christians of Turfan was Old Uyghur, to be differentiated from modern Uyghur. Often considered to be a dialect of Old Turkic, and obviously the most widely spoken language in the kingdom. Christian texts in Uyghur were written in both the Uyghur script and a modified version of the Syriac script. In addition, Brahmi script, Manichaean script, and other alphabets were used for Buddhist and Manichaean Uyghur texts, and you can see an example there in Brahmi script. And finally, allusions have already been made to the church, which was responsible for the spread of Christianity along the Silk Road as far as China. namely the Church of the East, often called by others the Nestorian Church, although that's the name that it never used of itself, and it's a highly problematic name, so it's not one that scholars in the field tend to use anymore. There's no question that the Christians in Turfan were members of this church, with its headquarters back in the Persian Sassanid Empire and then the Abbasid Caliphate, initially in Seleucia Ctesiphon and later in Baghdad itself. So all references to ecclesiastical structures in this talk should be understood as references to the Church of the East. Although we could say more about the long and glorious history of this church in Central Asia, time will not permit during this talk to dwell on that fascinating story. So we'll move on to a discussion of the Christian texts from Turfan. As noted in Erica Hunter's earlier lecture in this series, Christian texts were initially found by the Second Prussian Turfan expedition in the ruins of a former monastery of the Church of the East, located in Shuipang, near the site of Bulayak, about 10 kilometers north of Turfan. Erica Hunter also noted in her talk the fact that a Chinese excavation at the same site this past year has turned up hundreds of more manuscript fragments in Syriac and Uyghur script, which has certainly filled all of us who are interested in such things with great excitement. But back to the Christian fragments uncovered over a century ago, about which I've written more in my 2013 article. You can see a reference there on the screen. Erica Hunter has already alluded to the dating of some of these Christian texts, but just a reminder that as far as we can tell, they fall between the 9th century, when the Uyghur kingdom of Kocha was established, and the 14th century, when the Mongol era came to an end. In total, there are 1,092 Christian fragments in the Berlin collection, ranging from small scraps of paper up to the 61 folio Codex MIK 345, published by Erica Hunter and Chip Coakley in 2017. These include 481 catalog entries in our catalog of Syriac fragments that are at least half Syriac. Indeed, a decent number of our fragments are bilingual. In addition to Syriac, Christian fragments were also unearthed in Sogdian, in both Syriac script and Sogdian script, New Persian in Syriac script, Uyghur in both Syriac script and Uyghur script, and Middle Persian in Pahlavi script. Again, as mentioned by Erica Hunter, the Christian text can be subdivided by literary genre. Although I've not calculated the overall percentage for each genre when considering all the languages concerned, I have done this for the Syriac material and found the following proportions. Liturgical texts make up 43% of the Syriac material, followed by biblical texts, majoritively Psalters, Gospels, and lectionaries at 22%. Prayer texts, including the prayer amulets discussed by Erica Hunter in her earlier talk, make up 7% of the material, with an additional 2% being hagiographical and a further 5% counted as miscellaneous. Finally, at the time of publishing our catalog, manuscript of Syriac manuscript fragments in 2014, a full 10% of the fragments were considered unidentifiable, with another 10% not yet identified, but potentially identifiable. Suffice it to say that the proportions would be different if the Sogdian, Uyghur, Middle Persian, and New Persian fragments were taken into consideration. Notably, in contrast to the very significant number of liturgical texts found amongst the Syriac material, we find a much higher percentage of ascetic literature, commentaries, homilies, and hagiographies represented in the Sogdian text from Turfan, precisely the sort of text one would expect to be read in a monastic community. Moving further out from the liturgical and biblical center of the Christian literature from Turfan, one finds in the Uyghur manuscript fragments a mixture of genres, including a fair number of what we might term miscellanea or even secular texts, those which would not necessarily be used in a liturgical context, but which reflect rather the spoken language of the Christian community in Turfan. We'll begin our look at Christian texts found in Turfan with those used in a liturgical context, keeping in mind that there are far too many of these texts, especially in Syriac, to do justice to this genre in our limited time today. In addition to a large number of liturgical books exclusively in Syriac, including the aforementioned Codex MIK 345, there are also several examples from books where the main text is in Syriac, but the instructions to the priest are in Sogdian in Syriac script. usually rendered in rubrics. An important example of this can be found in two folios from a Syriac baptismal liturgy, and you can see one folio there on the right, published in 2011 by Sebastian Brock and Nicholas Sims Williams. Among other things, the priest is instructed in Sogdian to take the consecrated oil and to seal the unconsecrated oil on the altar with a sign of the cross. Another example of such a bilingual text consists of two folios from the Office of Morning Prayer. You can see one of them down on the bottom, N296. But this time with a Chinese Taoist text on the other side, published by Tsuneki Nishiwaki in 2001. Evidence of the interconfessional reuse of paper at Turfan. In this case, the Christian text was most likely written on the reverse side of the pre-existing Chinese texts. We have two examples of Christian creeds recited at Turfan, neither of them, interestingly, in Syriac. The first is a Sogdian version of the Nicene Creed in Sogdian script. You can see it there on your screen, published by Nicholas Sims Williams in 2014, which essentially follows the text of that creed as it is known in the West, albeit substituting Christian Church for Catholic Church. Other interesting points about this creed, which is incidentally a folio from a Psalter in Sogdian script, occur on its first line, where the title is given in Syriac script rubrics, both in Sogdian, where it says on the faith of Christianity, and Syriac, where it says we believe in one. Followed by two names in Sogdian script, Johannes, from a Syriac form of the name John, and Hatun, the Turkic word for lady, names which may indicate the owners of the manuscript. The other creed is in Uyghur, U5538, published by Peter Zima, initially in 1997-98, and again in 2015, which includes an interesting reference to Pontius Pilate as the fifth minister, an acknowledgement of his role as the fifth prefect or governor of Roman Judea. Also of interest in this text are the use of the Turkic phrase Aragiel, pure wind, to refer to the Holy Spirit, and the notion that salvation bestows divine favor or good fortune, translating a verb based on the Turkic idea of kut, meaning the favor of heaven, good fortune, or happiness. Although we lack definitive evidence, the presence of these two non-Syriac creeds at Turfan may suggest that the mother tongue of congregants, whether Sogdian or Uyghur, was used when reciting the creed during the liturgy rather than Syriac. From the liturgical text found at Turfan, we move on to the biblical texts, beginning with several bilingual Syriac-Sogdian biblical lectionaries, which I'll briefly mention before turning to a more extensive discussion of the Turfan Psalters. Apart from the fact that these lectionaries, 5 of them in total, are bilingual, with each verse or half verse rendered first in Syriac and then in Sogdian, perhaps their most interesting aspect is that they have recitation accents consisting of large dots above or below the text, designed to indicate the melody for chanting the text. These accents, visible on the folio shown in 201, and discussed in a 1919 article by Egon Bellis, provide important evidence of the role of music in the liturgy at Turfan. Lectionaries are, of course, evidence primarily used in a liturgical context. It is with the Turfan Psalters that we see more linguistic variety than in any other genre of Christian text from Turfan, something I've written about more extensively in my 2013 article on the importance of the Psalter at Turfan. The oldest Psalter from Turfan is the Middle Persian Psalter, of which there are 12 folios, or partial folios extant, written in a form of the Pahlavi script that is often referred to as Psalter Pahlavi, due to differences between that script and the standard book Pahlavi. Interestingly, although the text is obviously a translation from the Syriac Peshitta version of the Bible, it also contains elements of the Hebrew Masoretic text and the Septuagint. The manuscript of this Psalter is generally thought to be from the 6th or 7th century, although the text itself is older, probably from the 4th or 5th century. As far as we know, Middle Persian was not spoken by the Christian community in Turfan, although it was used in Manichaean script, not Pahlavi script, by the Manichaean community. The presence of this Psalter in Turfan suggests that it was brought from Persia by missionaries of the Church of the East. Philip Guignon's entry on the Pahlavi Psalter in the Encyclopedia Iranica provides more information on this fascinating text, including references to earlier publications on it. The very fragmentary remnants of a Syriac New Persian Psalter, here you see one of those fragments, testifies to the growing importance of the Persian language throughout Central Asia, even in a place like Turfan, where Uyghur was the language of the ruling elite and presumably most of the general population. This Psalter, considered to be the earliest known translation from Syriac into New Persian, and published by Nicholas Sims Williams in 2011, follows a similar pattern to that of the aforementioned bilingual lectionaries, with each half verse rendered initially in Syriac and then in Persian in Syriac script. We're also fortunate to have two fragments of a Sogdian Psalter published by Nicholas Sims Williams in two separate articles in 2004 and 2011, which follows the Syriac Peshitta version in some places and the Septuagint in others, but with a twist. The opening words of each psalm are in Greek as a headline in the upper margin of each fragment. It's just very vaguely visible in that bottom image, but it's hard to see in that particular image. This may be evidence of connections with Melkite Christians living further to the west in a Sogdian-speaking environment. The final biblical text I wish to touch on is a Psalter in the Syriac language written in Uyghur script, published by Peter Tsime and I in our 2014 article, Syro-Uygurica 1. There are a total of 9 folios from this Psalter, which reflects the correct Syriac pronunciation of the text, so that silent letters and spirantized versus non-spirantized letters are indicated. Here you see one of those folios, which contains a colophon-like statement in which someone, presumably in a position of authority, has given his signature 3 times, each time using a different term for the mark: Persian Nisan, Tibetan Lachi, and Turkic Tamga, which allows us to date this text to the Mongol era. The fact that the Syriac text is rendered in Uyghur script suggests that the Syriac script was not well known at the time it was written, but it was still important for those using this text to be able to accurately chant the Psalms, which played such an important role in the liturgy of the Church of the East. Hagiographies also play an important role in Christian literature and were especially beloved in monastic settings like that of Belaic, where the majority of the Christian textual fragments from Turfan were found. Of course, the line between hagiography and legend is very thin, hence the title of this section. The first text of this genre from Turfan I want to mention is a legend of Barshaba, extant in both Syriac and Sogdian, both published by Müller and Lentz in 1934. The Sogdian version, which you can see on the right, is part of an original codex that also contained the legend of the discovery of the cross by Saint Helen, Constantine's mother, and the martyrdom of the Roman saints Sergius and Bacchus. Barshaba, on whom see Nicholas Sims Williams' entry in Encyclopedia Iranica, is important because he was the legendary founder of Christianity in Merv in modern-day Turkmenistan. He's also mentioned in a fragment, now unfortunately lost, of a Sogdian lectionary from Turfan, as well as in the aforementioned liturgical codex MIK 345. Taken together, these texts tell us that Barshaba was celebrated by the Christians of Turfan at a time when the Church of the East still had a metropolitan bishop in Merv, one of its most important ecclesiastical centers, and undoubtedly the city from which its eastward missions were launched. Another hagiography that was evidently popular with the Turfan Christians was the martyrdom of St. George, extant in Syriac, Sogdian, and Uyghur. Here are folios from each of the versions. The 8 fragments of the Syriac version, originally published by Miklos Marot in 1991, are being revisited by Li Juan Lin, who has already published 2 important articles on the text in 2021. Lin has been able to make joins between fragments not made previously, as well as offering suggestions on the transmission history of the Syriac version of the legend, describing the Turfan text as, quote, an otherwise unattested version which contains more elements of the original from the Greek than all the transmitted Syriac manuscripts. The Sogdian version of George's martyrdom, comprising 16 extant fragments, was published by Olaf Hansen in 1941, Emil Benveniste in 1945, and Ilya Gershevich in 1946. The Uyghur version is extant in only one folio and was published by Albert von Lecoq in 1922, Willy Bang in 1926, and Peter Zima in 2015. A small portion of the text that is preserved in Uyghur, where George lists the advantages of invoking his name after his death, can be found in a similar but not identical form in the Syriac version from Turfan. The Uyghur version of the legend of St. George features a high view of the Virgin Mary, somewhat unexpected in a tradition that has viewed her traditionally as Christotokos, bearer of Christ, as opposed to Theotokos, bearer of God. Also of interest is the occurrence of the Uyghur word nom, from Greek nomos, law, used in Uyghur Buddhist texts to translate Sanskrit dharma, but here to express the idea of Christian doctrine. The focus in the text on invoking a saint's name calls to mind the prayer amulets discussed earlier by Erica Hunter. Although we do not know exactly how this text was used by Uyghur Christians, we might imagine them interpreting it as not only the courageous example of a martyr, but also an encouragement to call on St. George for physical healing and other personal needs. Yet another text that fits in this genre, usually referred to as an apocryphal tale, is the Uyghur translation of the Acts of Paul and Thecla, published by Peter Zima initially in 2002 and then again in 2015, which features the legendary figure of Thecla, a female follower of the Apostle Paul. The text, which follows the Greek original in many respects, also includes terminology commonly found in Uyghur Buddhist texts, such as referring to Paul as Arhat, enlightened one or saint, and using the term Burhan, usually translated as Buddha, to indicate a prophet and by extension Jesus. We might also note the use of the Uyghur phrase Burhan Larning Nomen, doctrine of the prophets, to describe the gospel that Paul preached, as well as the phrase narrow and compact deeds taken directly from Buddhist thought, which Paul uses when he is trying to dissuade Thecla from following him. The final text in this section is the Uyghur legend of the Magi, published several times, most recently by Peter Zima in 2015, a double folio written in Uyghur script, which unfortunately went missing during World War II, so all we have are photos from it. Whether it was translated from a Syriac or non-existent Sogdian original is unclear, but in keeping with the standard Syriac view that the Magi were of Persian origin, the story contains a reference to a fire in a well as an explanation of why, quote, to the present day, the Magi worship fire. A very similar story of the Magi is told by Marco Polo, certain elements of which can be traced back to the 10th century Muslim historian Masudi. Finally, the Persian term Tarsa found in this Uyghur text was used of and by Central Asian Christians over the course of many centuries, of which I've written in my 2020 article on the term. Although I've deliberately avoided referencing any of the amuletic prayer texts that Erica Hunter discussed in her talk in this series, I do want to mention two non-amuletic prayer texts I'm familiar with. The first such text is U338, a small booklet of 10 folios held together by thread and containing text in Syriac and Uyghur in both Syriac and Uyghur script. This booklet, described initially by Peter Zima in 2009, and then in my 2013 article, Syro-Uygurica 2, is obviously meant for Uyghur speakers. However, it also includes a prayer from the East Syriac Euchologion, uttered just before the catechumens, those who are not yet baptized, are dismissed from the service. The booklet also includes a colophon, or as near as we get to a colophon with the Christian text from Turfan, which mentions, quote, the year of the cow or ox, the first month on the 23rd day, end quote, as well as the scribe's name Bacchus, his father's name Jonah, Syriac Yonan, and a request that the merit of having written out the booklet would be transferred from son to father. The Buddhist practice of merit transfer is, of course, well known, but it's interesting to see it being used by Christians at Turfan. Although this colophon does not give us an exact date, the occurrence in it of the term Arikakutlar, the plural of Arkagun, a term of unclear origin that was used of Christians in the Mongol Empire, enables us to date the text to the 13th or 14th century. The second text I wish to address here, an Uyghur prayer of confession and supplication written in Uyghur script, consists of 4 fragments published by Peter Zima in 1974 and again in 2015. This prayer contains an interesting mixture of the language of judgment and mercy with a significant focus on evil deeds and their consequences, as well as a section where the writer addresses God directly. Amongst the terms used of God in the latter section, we read the phrase, mother to the motherless, father to the fatherless, seemingly an expansion on Psalm 68:5, which speaks of God as father to the fatherless. I've given into the temptation of lumping the remaining texts I want to discuss under the heading of miscellaneous, rather than sorting them more finely into separate genres. Erica Hunter mentioned in her talk the remnants of the Syriac pharmaceutical recipe book, which, amongst other things, gives instructions to, quote, pound together coriander seed and mouse droppings and mix with rose oil and daub, end quote, as a means of dealing with unwanted hair. This text was published initially by Miklos Marot in 1984 and more recently by Li Juan Lin in 2020, who has demonstrated the Galenic and Hippocratic origins of the extant recipes, a reminder of just how widespread Greek knowledge was at the time. While on the subject of pharmaceutical texts, I should mention that there are 2 fragments containing pharmaceutical recipes in New Persian, written in Syriac script, published by Nicholas Sims Williams in 2011. These fragments, with fold lines similar to some of the prayer amulets described by Erica Hunter, contain recipes for preparing pharmaceutical items, particularly medicinal oils. To these pharmaceutical recipe book fragments, we may add the testimony of U328, an Uyghur fragment in Syriac script, part of which I published in my 2021 article, Syro Uygurica 3, which contains pharmaceutical recipes for treating various diseases, including Kishining Bashitaspal Sar, when a person's head is bald. Taken together, these fragments in Syriac, Persian, and Uyghur suggest more than a passing interest in pharmaceutical matters amongst the Turfan Christians. Another interesting piece of miscellanea published by Miklos Marot in 1985 is a draft letter in Syriac to an unnamed Byzantine official, mentioning the emperor and his nobles, on the back of which we have the text of Proverbs 9:14 to 10:12, the only part of the Hebrew Bible not from the Psalter that has been found so far at Turfan. Also mentioned in, Also mentioned in Erica Hunter's talk is a double folio from a Syriac dialogue between a Jew and a Christian, a polemical text that centers around the nature of the Trinity, with the questions preceded by the Jew says, and the answers introduced by the Christian says, except where the scribe became confused and had the Christian asking questions and the Jew giving answers, only to be corrected by a later reader who was presumably not pleased with this role reversal. There are also several Syriac fragments that seem to be lists of names, including SIR-HT 355 and SIR-HT 161. On SIR-HT 355, we read simply, and Yohanan the visitor, and Israel, and Isho, Elia, ... the visitor, and Hananiah. On SIR-HT 161, we read Sabrisho, and Daniel, and Yohanan, and Abdisho, and Gewargis, and Ishak, ... scholars or students, ... and instead of Bogatotok. In contrast to the first 6 Syriac names visible on this fragment, the name on the last visible line is Turkic, combining the personal name Boga, meaning hero, brave warrior, with Totok, a Turkified Chinese loan word meaning military governor. Although there's not enough left of this fragment to be sure, I speculated in my 2009 article that this may be an example of new members of the monastic community taking Syriac names when they became monks, as was the case elsewhere with the Church of the East. If so, perhaps the final line originally read, and instead of Bogototok, he will have the name followed by a Syriac name. There are also 7 Syriac fragments of a philosophical text, here illustrated by N417 and N420, where we see the Syriac word kataphatakitha, representing the Greek loanword kataphatikos, meaning affirmative, as in an affirmative proposition, as Li Zhuan Lin has shown in a 2021 article. These fragments come from a Syriac translation of Aristotle's Categories, specifically chapter 7 on opposites. After comparing the Turfan fragments with the other 3 extant Syriac translations of the Categories, Lin suggests that the Turfan text, quote, could preserve elements from a 4th version of the Syriac Categories, end quote, due to differences between it and the other 3 Syriac translations. The philosophical fragments from Turfan are further proof of the influence that Greek philosophy had in the schools of the Church of the East, including those in monastic settings like at Bulayak. As Lin concludes, the discovery of the Turfan Categories challenges our knowledge of the reception of Aristotle's works in Central Asia and what is today China. An interesting text, which actually turns out to be trilingual, comprises a Syriac list of numbers with their Sogdian equivalents, on the back of which is what appears to be a draft letter in a mixture of Uyghur script and Syriac script. U7252 described in my 2009 article, Multilingual Christian Manuscripts from Turfan. The dimensions of the folio suggest that it was possibly originally a blank sheet from the same manuscript as the Sogdian Nicene Creed, and therefore the aforementioned Psalter in Sogdian script. On the one side, we see several columns in Syriac and Sogdian in Syriac script. In essence, the list gives Syriac numbers, both as letters of the alphabet and spelled out, with their Sogdian counterparts, perhaps for memorizing the numerical equivalents of Syriac letters in both languages, since these numbers are used in Syriac liturgical, biblical, and other manuscripts. The draft letter on the other side consists of 4 lines of Syriac, followed by 7 lines of Uyghur script with 4 interlinear lines, and a final line which begins in Uyghur and ends in Syriac. Simona Rashman, who kindly supplied me with a translation of the Uyghur portion, reads the addressee as Tangrikan el Almish al Kutlug, a very Turkic name indeed. Due to lacunae, the Syriac is very difficult to read, with only a few stock words and phrases visible, making the overall interpretation of this text rather difficult. At any rate, the letter shows us that the Turfan Christian community was hybrid, blending the lingua franca of Uyghur with the prestige of Syriac in a display of true multilingualism. There's a significant corpus of Christian calendrical texts from Turfan as well, 13 fragments in all, which Nicholas Sims Williams and I discussed in a 2012 article. The texts are in either Syriac or Sogdian and include lists of months, tables for finding movable dates that depend on the lunar calendar, notably Lent and Easter, and instructions for using those tables. I mention here 2 Sogdian calendrical fragments, N288 and N354. The former giving detailed instructions on how to calculate the beginning of Lent using the aforementioned tables, the latter, on the back of which is one of the tables, mentioning the great fast of Lent, the resurrection, i.e. Easter, the feast of the Ascension, and by inference, the feast of Pentecost. Another interesting Sogdian Christian text published by Nicholas Sims Williams in 2003 is a polemic against the Manichaeans, who are referred to as, quote, those non-Christians who confess 2 eternal beings, end quote. A tantalizing insight into interreligious relations in Turfan. There's also a Manichaean tract against the Christians published by Werner Zundermann in 2009. Unfortunately, apart from these 2 texts and the aforementioned use of some Buddhist terminology, we have little else to draw from in determining how the Christians in Turfan interacted with other religious groups in the oasis. One of the most interesting texts in the overall corpus we're discussing today is an Uyghur wedding blessing written in Syriac script, which provides rare insight into an important cultural ritual in the everyday life of Uyghur Christians from Turfan during the Mongol era, again based on the occurrence of the word Arkagun to refer to Christians. This text, published by Peter Zima in 1981 and again in 2015, draws on the biblical practice of invoking a blessing on others and was presumably meant to be prayed over the newlywed couple at some point in the wedding celebration. It mentions biblical patriarchs and heroes like Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, Joshua, and Samson, quotes from Paul's first epistle to Timothy in the New Testament, and includes references to 4 different Central Asian musical instruments. Also of interest is the slightly earthy and even suggestive language used of camels bellowing, lions roaring, and yaks digging up the ground, as well as the interesting concern that the bride and groom be, quote, good friends and excellent comrades, and that their in-laws work together. Finally, there are literally dozens of official letters, private letters, loan contracts, and private registers which have been identified as Christian in origin by Zimona Rashman in a 2009 article. Here we see one of these texts, U5623. The texts in question feature typical Christian names such as Anton, Saliba, Sargas, Gevargas, Johanan, Stephanos, Kyriakos, Shlemon, and Nestorius, not to mention more typically Turkic or even Sogdian names like Arslan, Barka, Timur, and Yoshmut. A couple of these fragments also mention deliveries of wine, not surprising given the presence of the monastery in Bulayak. Let me conclude with a few thoughts distilled from the many texts I've discussed today. Just a reminder that I have not addressed the majority of Syriac texts which are liturgical or biblical in nature, nor many of what Nicholas Sims Williams has described as, quote, the private reading matter of the Sogdian-speaking members of the Christian community in the Turfan Oasis, end quote. Whether they be saints' lives, commentaries, metrical homilies, or what we might term general Christian literature. Thus, fascinating as the texts I have chosen are, we should remember that they are not entirely representative of what Christians in Turfan were reading between the 9th and 14th centuries. Perhaps the most important observation, and one that has been made before, so it is hardly original, is that the Christian community in Turfan was multilingual, at least in terms of the texts that it produced and read, and multicultural in terms of the influences that can be traced in those texts. Although the core of the community likely started out as Sogdians, perhaps fleeing from Tang China after 845, and ended up being majoritively Turkic-speaking Uyghurs, Syriac continued to hold a place of prestige for Christians in Turfan, as was perhaps also the case with Middle Persian. We especially see the importance of Syriac in the aforementioned Psalter in Uyghur script, which may well have been the last form of that biblical text in Turfan, written in a script known to all in the Oasis with the purpose of preserving a text which had been recited in Syriac Christian communities for centuries. The community was obviously interested in a variety of genres, from the liturgical and biblical texts that were regularly recited, in the case of the monastic community at Bulayak, many of them on a daily basis, to those that would be read or consulted less frequently. Even those liturgical and biblical texts, which comprised the core of the life of the church in Turfan, were not immune from multilingual influence, as we see from the instructions to priests in Sogdian or the Creed in Uyghur. Existing in an environment where the rulers and elites were not Christian, it is perhaps not surprising that some of the texts exhibit the influence of the surrounding culture, specifically the Buddhist terminology and practice mentioned above. There does not seem to be any evidence of such influence from Manichaeism. Another cultural influence that is apparent from some of the texts is that of Greek thought, mediated through the Syriac tradition, which had a long history of interest in Greek thinkers and their works. This is most evident in the philosophical and pharmaceutical fragments, but a Greek connection can also be seen in the headlines of the aforementioned Sogdian Psalter and the draft letter to a Byzantine official, perhaps indicating some form of relationship with Melkite Christians in Sogdiana. The literature left behind by the Turfan Christians maintained the all-important link with the Church of the East, with its outposts along the Silk Road stretching all the way back to the Mesopotamian homeland. At the same time, There was also room to include material not attested in Syriac texts known to us, such as the references to Pontius Pilate as the fifth minister in the Uyghur Creed, or the reason that the Magi worship fire in the Uyghur legend of the Magi, or the phrase mother to the motherless, father to the fatherless in the Uyghur prayer of confession and supplication. And finally, it is clear from the extant texts, especially the what we might term secular documents discussed by Zamona Rashman, that like the Christian community commemorated in the gravestone corpus from Kyrgyzstan, these Christians from Turfan sported a variety of names taken not only from their roots in the Syriac-speaking world, but also from the surrounding Turkic-speaking culture. In short, the Turfan Christians seem to have made every attempt both to maintain their religious identity and to integrate into the general society where they lived. And with that, thank you very much. If you have any questions that aren't covered in the Q&A, feel free to email me. My email is there. You can find most of the articles I mentioned on my academy.edu page. And thank you again.